What's up, y'all? It's Shuffle, and today's Darkest Dungeon 2 video is going to be reviewing the early access and deciding if you should be buying it or not. As always though, before we get started, if you enjoy the video, make sure to leave a like, leave your thoughts down below in the comments, then make sure to check out the description box for all the cool links like Discord, Twitter, Twitch, Patreon, and things like my Epic Game Store code if you want to support the channel. First, let's start off with the changes from Darkest Dungeon 1. There are several, but these are probably the biggest ones. First, there is no hamlet, so there's no thing to upgrade and take heirlooms back to work on in between besides your characters. There is no leveling weapons or armor or heroes. The only progression system you really get besides leveling your account, which gives you more access to items and such like that, is spending mastery points on your heroes to upgrade their skills, which actually does matter quite a lot. Unlike the first game, this one is also much faster paced. Instead of having a hamlet that you build up and then all of your units that you build up over time, this one is a game that's going to have 5 acts. Currently, early access only has 1 of them, and the act, I believe, dictates what the final boss is. So you spend about 5 hours, sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 6, but 5 is a pretty good rough estimate. And you spend about 5 hours going through the entire game. You go through 3 biomes, the starter area, and then the mountain, which is the final area. When you start the run, you pick 4 heroes out of the roster, and these are the 4 you're supposed to take all the way to the top. But if for some reason someone dies on the way there, if you make it to an inn, which is a checkpoint at the end of each biome or region, however you want to describe it, you'll get a replacement. This replacement is random and you don't get to pick it, so that kind of sucks. But sometimes it can make you get interesting team combinations that you did not think of before. Now let's start with the review part of the video, which is most likely the meat and potatoes. So for the review portion, I want to start with the idea, or point rather, that the game is obviously not finished. This is early access, much akin to a beta period. Early access for Darkest Dungeon 1, I believe, launched with between 8 and 10 characters, I forget the exact number. This game has 9, which is a pretty healthy roster to start with, honestly. And they're going to add more over time. We don't know exactly how many, but I would assume it's maybe around 4 to 5 by the time it comes out of early access. Regardless, more heroes are coming. This is a point of contention I hear quite often, but there will be more heroes, so don't worry. The one new hero that was added was Runaway. She's pretty cool. She's a fire-based character. Fire is a new mechanic in the game, but she also has a lot of utility and the potential to heal and cure blind and stuff like that, so this character is really fun. I like how they implemented her. The animations are very good, and her skills are fun, and she has a few different builds, which I think that's probably what you want out of each character, is just a lot of options and a bit of flair so they look cool doing it. So far, the game has 3 fully done biomes. These are what we're calling the regions. So it has the Sprawl, it has the Tangle, and it has the Fetter, or Foder. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. People told me Fetter, so I'm going with Fetter. But each of these biomes are, for the most part, done. They have all the nodes that they're going to have. They might add more nodes just generally in the future, but they have a list of enemies, they have a boss in each region, they have trinkets, and then once you go through them, you get to the next checkpoint, and then you can start another biome. There are 2 main focal points of this game, though, that I do need to touch on. The first is the combat, and the second is the relationship system. For the combat, I think the combat in this game is vastly superior to the first one. I know some people don't like it, but I personally really enjoy the combat in Darkest Dungeon 2 a lot more than the first one, just because I think the tokens are more fun to play around. They give you more strategy avenues that you can explore and ways to tackle problems that you didn't have in the first game, and I like that quite a lot. Obviously, it needs some fine-tuning because Red Hook hasn't done this type of system before, but I think with time they will get it down to where it feels more consistent and not as potentially easy as it is now, because you have to remember, all this is kind of new from their end, so it's understandable that it's not as polished as it could be. But what I like is that certain enemies get things like their own buff tokens, like the cultists get worship and stuff like that, where they can pass it to like the super cultist that gets powered up moves, so you can kind of plan around what it's going to do. There's more thinking involved than Darkest Dungeon 1. Darkest Dungeon 1 was just like, cap your accuracy, be faster than the enemy, and then you're probably going to win most things that aren't boss fights. Otherwise, like I said, I really do enjoy the token system. I like the feeling of being able to plan ahead. Not only can the players see the turn order, but now you can have more planning because of tokens. So if you want to set up a really good attack, for instance, if your Hellion has Howling End, or whatever her really high damage move is that she can use every other turn, you can have that, get it ready, get her maybe a strength token or a guaranteed crit token, and then hit the enemy with vulnerable so they take 50% more damage, and then just bop them for like literally 40 or 50 damage. I think Hellion's gotten the highest crit that I've seen so far. She got like 67, so that's really cool. It's fun to plan around, and like I said, I've been greatly enjoying the token system, and even though this game isn't finished, The combat right now is enough to keep me wanting to play it. The relationship system is the other big hallmark of the game. This replaces afflictions and virtues, but they act pretty similar in a lot of ways. If your character hits 10 stress, they drop down to only a couple HP, not exactly death's door. They have something called a meltdown, and in the meltdown state, they destroy their positive relationships and have worse ones, like you build up quicker to the bad relationships. And when you have positive or negative relationships, they're a pretty big impact. So these go both ways. If it's positive or negative, your resists change. Obviously, if it's a negative relationship, your resists go down, and if it's positive, they go up. This includes, like, I think pretty much every resist, even Deathblow resist, which is pretty cool. And the other factor is, depending on what relationship status you have with the other members of the team, determines what kind of tokens you start handing each other during combat. So if you have negative relationships, you can hand your allies weak tokens so they do half damage, or if that relationship is positive, you can hand them buff tokens like giving them 50% extra damage, for instance. Other factors are a little more obvious and easier to understand, such as healing teammates, taking the hits for teammates, or stressing them out, or stress healing them. And I think one of my favorite things that they've added is when you have positive relationships, certain ones, I think it's like respectful and maybe inseparable, I can't remember exactly, maybe hopeful. Anyway, you get to like follow up with attacks against the enemy. So I'm pretty sure it's respectful that has this. So you swing at the enemy, and if you get the respectful proc, your teammate that you have respect with will jump in and hit the enemy with you and do other effects like just damage or bleed or something like that. That stuff is really fun. And then also sometimes you can take the hit for your teammates as well. This kind of sucks if you have a tank on the team because you don't want your jester jumping in to take hits for man-at-arms, but it's still a really cool thing to have. And I honestly love the relationship system. I think it's great. I think it's a very defining feature of the game. It's obviously in need of some tweaks. I think they already did some stuff in the first couple days, like they lowered the frequency of relationship stuff, but it's a great system and it's an awesome foundation that they have, and I'm really excited to see what they do with it. One criticism I hear quite a lot is that this game is considered easier, and this is something I'm planning to make a full video on sometime soon. I just don't know exactly when. But when people say it's easier, I think the reason is a couple things. One, it's early access, so the balancing isn't, perfect. And the other is people are coming from a Darkest Dungeon 1 background where many of them already understand how to play that game. So the transition to this one probably isn't as steep. It's kind of like when you play your first Souls game, your next one is consequently a bit easier just because you understand the pacing and such. So I think the same thing applies here. But the other thing that I want to touch on with why it might be considered easier right now is because there's more strategic elements in terms of tokens, which means there's less variance. Darkest Dungeon 1 has a lot of variance. It does a good job of masking its difficulty. It's not that difficult of a game. Like, it is challenging. I'm not going to say it's not, but a lot of the challenge that it may feel like it has comes from like the early weeks of the game when you don't have accuracy, for instance. So Darkest Dungeon has, or the first one has, way more variance in what happens between speed rolls, accuracy, resist checks, all that kind of stuff, damage. There's just so much more variance in that game that if you get like a couple bad instances of variance on your side and the enemy just crits you in return and punishes a mistake you made, it can feel way harder than it actually is when it's mostly just dice rolls. Next, I'll talk about my critiques of the game before I talk about what I like and then give the final verdict here. But my critiques so far are, I don't like the way the unlocks are handled. I actually like the hero shrines. Personally, I like the backstory stuff, which I'll talk about in a minute, but I wish you got to pick what skill you unlocked when you did the backstory shrines, because there might be some build you want to do, and you want that move immediately, and you don't want to have to wait, 2 or 3 runs to get all the shrines done. I also wish that when you level up your account, you could pick which hero you wanted to unlock, give players a little more agency over how they want to play the game, instead of saying, yeah, Leper's a fan favorite, but you have to get to level 12 before you get to play a fan favorite character. My next critique is that Red Hook said they wanted healing to be harder to do. That's why, or I suspect that's why Vessel's not in the game at all, or yet, or whatever you want to say. But healing has a lot of conditions. You usually have to be lower HP in order for heals to even take effect. This way you don't have to stall to get to full HP and stuff. Heals also have limited uses. So from the character standpoint, there are much weaker heals out there. They're not as consistent, they're not as powerful as they were in the first game, but they're still good, and it's worth running them. But Red Hook, on one hand, says that we want healing to be less, and at the same time, on the other hand, they give you healing combat items. Combat items don't take your turn, which I think is cool. That's how it was in the first game. You could just spend items in combat, and it was fine. But for this one specifically, in Darkest Dungeon 2, you get things like Healing Salve and later on Triage Kits, which heal a third or half of your HP respectively, and those are very powerful. You can do some runs without main healers, like I've done that. I've ran without Plague Doctor or Occultist in the team, and I just, you know, had a couple self-heals and items, and it was completely fine. Well, I shouldn't say completely fine, but it was manageable, and I was able to still beat the game that way, so I do appreciate being able to do that, but the healing from items may be a bit too powerful and too plentiful, so I don't know if they're going to change that or not. Maybe they don't need to. We'll have to see when they have more difficult enemies out there. But as it stands right now, one of the core design philosophies is they want less healing, but then they give you items where everyone can heal pretty much whenever they want, and I feel like that kind of breaks that idea. Although, like I said, it's a tight rope to walk, because at the same time you want less healing, but the enemies still have to be threatening. But you also don't want to be pigeonholed into running a healer in every single run. I couldn't think of the word there. So I'm not really sure how you would balance that. Maybe just make Healing Salve down to like 25% or 20% HP instead of 33. Something like that, but that's the idea right now. My next critique is that stress healers are almost required. They're about as close to required as you can get, and I'll talk about why, I guess, in a minute here. But with stress healers, you have some main options. The easiest one is Plague Doctor with Ounce of Prevention upgraded. That's probably the one everyone's gravitating towards. Another is Man Arms with Bolster, but later on you get some other stress healers like Jester, and surprisingly Hellion is a very good stress healer. And it feels like one of these characters should be on the team, otherwise you're going to struggle massively. Maybe that's by design, just because stress is an integral part of Darkest Dungeon, but I don't like having to make sure I have at least one of these characters on the team, just to ensure that my run is consistent. The reason the stress healer is so important is because of the relationship system. Relationships can swing pretty wildly in both directions. Your first run, you may not run a stress healer, or you may not be as aggressive with stress healing, and your team's gonna get stressed out. They're gonna start yelling at each other, and then you're gonna have negative relationships all over the place, and then you just can't beat the game because every single turn you're giving, you know, your Hellion and your Leper weak tokens, you're giving everyone else stress so they're melting down and hitting 0 HP, which makes your healers take more strain. There's just all these things that can snowball it in either direction, and it's because of stress. So if your stress is, you know, 4 or higher pretty much, alongside your torch condition, your team's yelling at each other, you're getting negative relationships, and that sucks. Meanwhile, if you can keep your stress under 4 and your torch high, and then use some items at the end that boost relationships and stuff like that, your team will just buff each other up. They'll be so positive. You'll have positive relationships all over the place on all 4 of them, and you're basically just handing out 4 virtues to your entire team. They're going to be way stronger than they should be, and then you're likely not able to lose the run from that point. So right now, the meta, if you can call something like that even applicable to Darkest Dungeon 2, is you bring a stress healer early. They have a team skill that stress heals, so that way that person builds positive relationships with everyone. You keep your stress down. Eventually, the rest of your team builds a positive relationship, and then by the end of the first area, you're just supercharged and ready to go. This also ties into my next point, which is the difficulty really is just front-loaded. So once you get out of the valley, that's the first, you know, quote area, and you go into your first biome, where you get to choose the Tangle, the Sluice, the Better, and the Sprawl. So once you get to pick one of those, that first region is likely going to be your hardest for the entire run. And the reason is, you only get 1 mastery point after the valley. I wish this was 2 or 3 just to offset this difficulty curve a little bit. So you get your 1 mastery point, you give it to Plague Doctor with Ounce of Prevention, you go into the next area, like I said, you farm all your positive relationships, and then usually you're okay. But even then, even with that in mind, with the chance of having 1 mastery point, you only get to pick 1 thing, which means you don't get to upgrade the rest of your moves, which means all these enemies that don't scale through the game, all their difficulties up front, which makes the Sprawl probably the hardest starting area just because of pit fighters. But if you're able to make it through the first area with your 1 mastery point, maybe get a couple decent trinkets, and you get to the next inn with like 3 to 5 mastery points, you can probably win the game after that. It's actually not as challenging going into the second region or the third. Honestly, if you make it to the third region, you've probably won. I have not seen a run fail. I don't think I've had one fail after getting past or getting into the third region, unless I fought a boss or just, you know, a bunch of random bad stuff happened. For the most part, if you get to the third biome in good shape, you have some positive relationships, you're going to steamroll the back end of the game. I think another reason for this difficulty curve, besides the opening mastery points, is that the enemies don't really scale going into the later areas. So I think going forward, you know, if we only get 1 mastery point forever from the valley, that's understandable. But I think the first area, the enemy should be a bit weaker on normal, just maybe cut their HP by like 10%, cut their damage by 1 or 2 points. And then the enemies we have now, that could be like the second biome. And then when you get to the third one, just bump their stats up a little bit, just to match the player power curve. Because right now, the player feels like you're pretty weak for the valley in the first biome, then you're moderately strong for the second one, and then you're just overpowered by the third one. I think between a scaling system and an eventual, heat gauge or ascension style, I think that will really solidify the difficulty in this game, and I'm looking forward to something like that. Now it's time for my favorite parts of the game. I love the combat. I think the combat's fantastic. I love the foundation of it. I think the tokens are awesome. I know some people don't like them, like I said, but I really enjoy the strategic element that they're going to bring. There's more thinking involved compared to Darkest Dungeon 1, where, like I said, you just get some accuracy capped up, and then you get some speed, maybe a couple stuns, and then you're just gonna steamroll it. Like I said, there's more thinking, there's more room for creativity in the token space, so I'm very happy with it. I'm very excited to see where that goes. Next, of course, is the artistic stuff, so art, visuals, the music, the atmosphere, Wayne June's narration, all of it is fantastic. I'm glad they got the winning formula back together. It's a shame that we don't have the Ancestor, and this time we have the Academic, and Wayne still does a fantastic job delivering the lines. The writing is still amazing, obviously, but the Ancestor isn't the same character, or this time it's the Academic, so we don't get all the snarky comments and the intrigue around the Ancestor. So far, the Academic seems to be a pretty straightforward dude. Like I said, it's all still very enjoyable. As great as the combat and visuals and atmosphere and all that are, I think my favorite part might actually be the hero backstories. So in the first game, we got hero backstories added kind of at a later time, and they weren't directly in the game. These are comics that were drawn to show how each character got to the game, basically. And this game takes those comics, but then fleshes them out more and gives them narration and some really fun stuff too, like having story sequences using fight mechanics. Sometimes these fight mechanics aren't the same as the original game, or I should say the base game, whatever you want to call it, but they have their own unique stuff, characters get unique moves, to deal with those backstory issues. The backstory events themselves are very well made, and they have a lot of variety. For instance, you can do Dismas, the Highwayman, you can see how he gets out of jail, or you can use Jester, and one of his backstory events is him having some kind of like musical duel with some other dude. I think the backstory stuff is a very good addition because it gives you something else to do besides just trying to win the game, you get to learn more about the characters, and that's really fun. My final favorite thing on this list is a small one, and that's the fact that the game has less downtime. This is more important for people like me who stream the game and make content, where the only downtime really are the ends. Whereas in the first game, even if you knew what you're going to do, you still had to spend a lot of time in the hamlet, which means that in terms of speed for content creation, this is something I greatly enjoy. Now it's time for the final portion of the video. Is the game worth $30? Is it worth your money? Well, first of all, I really don't like having these types of claims just because money is relative, and is your $30 worth my $30? I don't know. I can't answer that question. But for me personally, is it worth $30? Hell yeah, it is. If you really enjoyed the first one and you have the hardware requirements to run this one, I think you would enjoy this one and find a lot of fun playing it. However, that's only if the things that I talked about before are of interest to you. If you want a different type of combat, but it still feels similar in other ways, if you want to learn more about the characters, if you're okay with the change in systems, if you're okay with it being less RPG and more roguelike, then sure, all those things are pretty good. But if you don't like the other stuff that I talked about, like the art or the direction of balance or the direction the game went in, then maybe you could skip it. But for me personally, as a huge fan of Darkest Dungeon 1, I really like what they did with the second one. I like the direction it went in. I like that they just didn't do Darkest Dungeon 1.5 and call it a day, because that would have been easy money for them. They took a lot of risks, and they're still taking those risks, and I really like that. I appreciate it, and I like the game for what it is. If $30 is too steep for you, there is a deal with Epic Game Store where if you sign up for their newsletter, you can get a $10 off coupon. So if this is your only purchase on Epic Games, you can grab that coupon and then use it on this game. One final reminder, if you do want to buy it on Epic, then please use code SHUFFLE, all caps, at the creator box thing at checkout to help support the channel. If you're one of those that wants to wait until it leaves early access and comes to other platforms such as Steam and Nintendo Switch, stuff like that, they have said that early access is the only exclusive period. And then also after that, there have been a few times where I believe Tyler Sigmund on Twitter and maybe in interviews and stuff has mentioned he does like the console market, so it should come to console at some point in time. I don't know if that's going to be right after early access or shortly after. Alright, well, that's going to do it for this one. I hope it was informative. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, leave your thoughts in the comments. Check out the box for all the cool links, as I said, and then stay tuned for more Darkest Dungeon stuff. I stream on Twitch 4 days a week minimum, so if you want to go check out the Darkest Dungeon 2 live, then please do so. And for other videos coming up, I have some ideas such as doing some overview of changes between the two games more in depth than what I did at the start of this one. And then there's one I want to talk about breaking down Hellion, of all people, because she's actually a lot better than we all think. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.